Hello, everyone. So today I will be discussing the science behind activating the right hemisphere. And so mainstream science says that there's some utility in becoming a more right hemisphere person. The argument here is that these days we are incentivized to be extremely analytical, rational, and so these tend to be more functions of the left hemisphere. And in doing so, we are losing part of ourselves, which relate to, for example, the ability to be creative, the ability to seeing the bigger picture, the ability to being more connected with experience at an aesthetic level. And so one of the interesting parts here is that even though we tend to see society as being more left hemisphere dominant, if you look at the news, it very quickly becomes apparent that rationality and being analytical goes out the window pretty quickly. But so before I move on to the techniques on how to activate your right hemisphere, I will be discussing just very quickly the neurobiology behind the hemispheres and what we know about each one of them. And so the brain is divided in two hemispheres, the left and right hemisphere. And although the two hemispheres are very similar to one another, they are better at specific tasks. And this phenomenon is called lateralization. And so to clarify, most people exhibit left hemisphere dominance. And what dominance means in this context is simply that their language centers are located in the left hemisphere. And so by language areas, we are mainly talking about the Broca area and Wernicke's area. Broca's area is associated to the production of speech, while Wernicke's area is associated to the comprehension of language. And so throughout lesion studies, we know that if we damage one of these areas, we'll have different deficits in language. But so essentially what this means and what I'm trying to get at to is that most people are left hemisphere dominant. And one good way of determining whether someone has right or left hemisphere dominance is simply by understanding what is their dominant hand. This is not a perfect way to identify this because, like I said, most of the population is left hemisphere dominant, and so this means that even if you are left-handed, it probably means that you are still left hemisphere dominant. And so another thing which is important to understand about how our brain hemispheres work is that they operate in a contralateral way. So this means that the right hemisphere is controlling the left side of our body, and the left hemisphere is controlling the right side of our body. And so this is what is meant by contralateral organization. And so this means that the right side of our visual experience is being processed by our left hemisphere, and the left side of our visual experience is being processed by our right hemisphere. And so I mentioned before that the left hemisphere is highly involved in language. But this is not the only remark that must be done when it comes to the left hemisphere, because the left hemisphere is also normally associated with more analytical, sequential, logical reasoning. And so our left hemisphere is essentially always trying to understand the world, seeking certainty, drawing connections, and understanding and problem solving. And so when we think about mathematical computations, that's more so of a left hemisphere task. When we are discussing the right hemisphere is more connected with the, I think a good way to describe this would basically it's more connected with what the poet John Keats argued, which is the negative capacity. So it's this ability to be with experience, this ability to be more creative, this ability to step outside the realm of reason and logic. And so essentially what we have is when these two hemispheres collaborate, we have the left hemisphere, which is more analytical, and then we have the right hemisphere, which has a greater capacity to be with aesthetic experience, be with creativity. The two of them together are fundamental in terms of creating an embodied cognitive experience. And so what we know also from the studies and some of the hypotheses that allow us to understand somewhat how these two hemispheres operate is that in terms of understanding meaning in the world, of understanding logic, the left hemisphere has a filtering effect on the right hemisphere. And so, as I mentioned before, the right hemisphere has this more open-minded, this open interpretation of things and associations. And through that, the right hemisphere is able to draw a lot of different associations. And so what some researchers think that the left hemisphere does is that it tries to suppress or at least constrain some of these wide associations that the right hemisphere does. And there are practical reasons to do that, right? Because if we start seeing connections in everything, if we don't filter out some aspects of our experience, then our ability to make decisions and navigate the world will probably be impaired. It's also important to mention that the two hemispheres are connected by what is called the corpus callosum, which is a very large tract of nerve fibers which connect the two hemispheres. And so this allows the hemispheres to share information with one another. Now, we also know from split brain studies, which are essentially happen as a consequence of some surgeries for epilepsy, where their corpus callosum is severed. And what happens here is that the two hemispheres stop communicating to each other in the way that they did before. And so there starts to exist an asymmetry of information between the two hemispheres. And so what happens in this case is that many times there is a conflicting intention between the right and left hemisphere. It's as if you actually have a split person. And so what has been documented in some of these patients who have undergone this type of surgery is that, for example, they're going out to reach an object, for example, a cup of water or something else, and as they're extending their right arm, their left arm brings the right arm back. So there's this conflicting intention. And so there's a lot of different cognitive experiments that depict this idea of the split brain, and I can do a different video specifically on that. So it's very interesting about how the brain operates. And it's also important to mention that even though in a split brain, this difference in the intentions, this difference in the way the two hemispheres operate is very salient, it is also true that even for us, for people who haven't gone through this type of surgery, there is still an asymmetry of information going on. So it's not always that information is perfectly shared among the two hemispheres. That being said, I was mentioning the idea of lateralization, that these two hemispheres are better at specific things than one another. But it's also important to say that some of the literature and some of the studies, and at least some of the things I see in pop neuroscience, over-exaggerate how these two hemispheres are different, because at the end of the day, they're pretty similar. I mean, we have documented cases of people who were born with just one hemisphere, or that they even lost the other hemisphere due to a stroke and they didn't realize it. So the brain has this ability to use existing hardware, rewire itself, and adapt to changes. This is called the phenomenon of plasticity. And so this is just to say that, for example, through lesion studies, we know that damage to the left hemisphere can cause, for example, deficits in language, called so different types of aphasia. And that damage, for example, to the right hemisphere can impair the recognition of faces, which is called prosopagnosia. We know that that these changes, these differences between the hemispheres are not as big as sometimes we hear. In terms of how the hemispheres work and they're organized and how they're structurally built, there's also some interesting literature that tries to, through neuroimaging studies, to understand what is going on in certain cases of pathology. So, for example, when we look at schizophrenia, there is a line of research which argues that an asymmetry in the language centers, in the distribution of the language centers among the two hemispheres, is observed in those with schizophrenia. So, what do I mean by this? What these researchers are trying to communicate is that normally language centers tend to be located in the left hemisphere, or at least they tend to be located mostly in one hemisphere. And in the case of those with schizophrenia, some studies have observed that instead of these language centers being concentrated in just one hemisphere, they're actually spread out between the two hemispheres. And so this lack of asymmetry in the position of these language centers could be one of these structural issues in the brains of those with schizophrenia. And this is also argued for the cases of those with bipolar disorder, although in bipolar disorder, the findings also relate to the thickness of the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum being that thick bundle of nerve fibers that connect the two hemispheres. And so there's some idea that the fact that we have these language centers being distributed in a certain way between the two hemispheres may cause impairments in language. And we know that, for example, in the cases of those with schizophrenia, we often see changes in language comprehension and language use. This is the case, for example, within the word salad, which is when the person is mixing words in a way that for the person who is hearing them, they don't seem to have any association. So these are completely unrelated words that they're bundled together and they do not form any sort of apparently coherent meaning. And so this could be, in a way, a representation of the two hemispheres fighting for the construction of language or the comprehension of language. So we still need to understand more what is the consequence of this asymmetrical distribution of our language centers throughout the brain. Why is it that that neurological finding leads or seems to be correlated with schizophrenia? But that could be a possibility, that given that these two hemispheres tend to see or operate within the world in a different way, that if they are having equal or a more similar impact on how language is used, that they're gonna, due to their divergent modes of being, that they're going to create conflicts in how language is being used. So this is just something that is interesting to think about, but we still need to understand more what the consequence here is. There is some work being done on trying to understand how to activate a certain hemisphere. And for a lot of people, the interest is on activating more of the right hemisphere because people associate that with being more creative, with being more mindful, being more present and embodied with experience. And so in that respect, as I mentioned before, the neurotypical brain seems to be characterized by having left hemisphere lateralization for most language processing tasks. But as I said before, in terms of understanding the symbolic meaning of words, of phrases, sentences, of understanding figurative expressions, so expressions that go beyond the literal meaning of the words, the right hemisphere seems to be essential in terms of integrating and understanding that information. And so one study tried to see whether activating the right hemisphere through a task which was simply contracting the left hand. So as I said, the hemispheres have a contralateral organization. So this means that my left arm, my left hand is under the control of my right hemisphere. And so what they tried to understand was whether they could stimulate the right hemisphere by having participants engage in left hand contraction. So they would contract their hands, they would have like a ball, rubber ball, and they would contract it for 45 seconds, they would rest, and then they would repeat this 3 or 4 more times. And so after doing that task, they would see if the people, after those contractions, had improvements in their ability to understand these figurative expressions. And so there is some utility to this idea of stimulating the right hemisphere in order to understand, for example, better these figurative expressions. This is, for example, something that can be very useful for people who are on the autism spectrum, where there is some difficulty in understanding expressions that are not literal, so figurative expressions. And so what this study showed, that what they observed was that these left-hand contractions enabled people to have a better understanding of figurative expression. Another set of studies which was interesting, in which they had people contract both the left and the right hand, they saw that there was a difference in effect. So what they saw was that, for example, left-hand contractions were observed to trigger a sadness and to increase negative perceptions and judgments, while right hand contractions which led to left hemisphere activation, reduced the negative emotions and attitudes towards adversity. And so this is a very interesting observation. We cannot claim this to be an extremely solid observation because there are also other studies which show no real effect in terms of doing this dual contraction. But it just shows how these two hemispheres work in harmony. And so it is very important to have this balance between these two sides of the brain, because given their specializations, we need one aspect of the right hemisphere, we need other aspects of the left hemisphere. So it is very important to have both of these together. And just to clarify, before I mentioned Broca's area and Wernicke's area as being two of the most important language areas in the brain. But as we know from neurobiological studies, is that these two regions of the brain are not sufficient to explain language. And so this should not be surprising because, as we know, the brain functions through various systems, and it's very hard to reduce one language, especially a function such as complex as language, to just two areas of the brain. But some of you might be wondering, because, for example, contracting my left hand and contracting my right hand, these are motor actions. So these are actions which engage the motor regions of the brain. And so this is just to mention that when it comes to language production, especially to language production, the motor regions of the brain are also very involved. And so when we think this is just something for those of you who are more curious about this, is just that the language is not just a matter of those two regions. We actually have a very big involvement of the motor cortex in terms of explaining how all of these things are developed. In terms of other activities which you can use, or methods that you can use to stimulate more of your right hemisphere, physical exercise is a very good method of doing so. You have mindfulness, you have, for example, and not just mindfulness, basically any stress reduction method, yoga nidra, all of those modalities will engage more of your right hemisphere. And so also doing art, so painting, writing, fiction, so anything that allows you to sort of step out of your self-referential thinking, out of that simply being in the box of reason and logic. That's a good way to try to activate more of your right hemisphere. And just to clarify, when I say stepping out of logic and reason, I'm not saying that the left hemisphere is purely rational and the right hemisphere is irrational. It's just that both of these hemispheres allow us to process data about our environment in an embodied way, because, as you know, if we only understand the world through reason and logic, we are doomed to not understand it, because we are leaving so much out of the equation. And all of us know that logic and reason is an extremely limited tool. And so if we're able to include more of an experiential aspect to our understanding of the world, which comes from the right hemisphere, the ability to see the big picture and those big associations, then we are better able to navigate the world. And so hopefully you found this video useful. We still need to understand far more about how these two hemispheres interact with each other. These methods that I told you, including the hand contractions, the stress reduction methods, and physical exercise, which helps engage more of your right hemisphere. The dose-effect relationship of these methods in terms of, activating your right hemisphere is still not fully understood. So these are just things these are pointers towards that capacity to engage more of your right hemisphere. But this doesn't mean that these are actual sufficient and effective tools for all of us. But just give it a try. Try out the hand contraction exercises and let me know in the comments if you experience something different. For example, you can pick up a book, a fiction book that you have somewhere around, and do some left hand contractions and read the page while after doing the left hand contractions, and then reread the passage, for example, by doing right-handed contractions, and see if there's anything different in your experience and comprehension of the text. So thank you once again. Hope you found this video useful.